I remember the first night I heard it like it was yesterday, even though it was over a decade ago. My grandparents' house sat at the edge of a ridge, where the forest pressed close and the wind seemed to moan through the pines all year long. The attic had always been just a dusty, unused space in my mind, a place for forgotten furniture, old trunks, and the musty smell of decades gone by. I never thought much of it. That night I had gone up to fetch a box of holiday decorations. The wooden ladder groaned beneath my weight, and the air hit me like it had been waiting, cold and stale, pressing against my face. I noticed a faint scratching first, soft, irregular, like fingernails dragging across old, dry wood. I froze, thinking it must be rats, or maybe just the house settling, old beams creaking as they always had. But then came the whispering. It wasn't words I could understand at first, more like fragments, low, half-formed syllables that seemed to curl around the shadows. I tell myself now I could have imagined it, but it was too precise, too deliberate to be the wind or a trick of my mind. Each night after that, the sounds grew bolder. The scratching and whispers would start shortly after sunset, when the house was quiet and the forest beyond darkened to a solid black. Sometimes I'd catch the corners of the attic twitching with movement when I wasn't looking directly at them, the shadows shifting just out of the beam of a flashlight. I started dreading the evenings, staying downstairs as long as possible, telling myself I had better things to do than investigate a few noises. But curiosity has a way of gnawing at you, and one evening I couldn't take it anymore. I carried a small flashlight up the ladder, my hands slick with sweat even though the air was freezing. The attic felt heavier that night, like it was breathing around me. I clicked the flashlight on, the thin beam barely cutting through the thick dust motes floating in the stale air. The whispering started almost immediately, softer at first, then insistent, curling around the rafters. I could feel it brushing against the back of my neck like a shadowed hand, and I swear I sensed movement just beyond the light. I called out softly, my voice cracking, but the sound bounced back to me in the low, vibrating murmur of the attic. I remember climbing cautiously along the floorboards, stepping lightly, trying to locate the source. There was nothing visible, just boxes, old furniture draped in yellowed sheets, and the familiar shapes of trunks that had been there my entire childhood. The whispers grew clearer as I moved, a faint cadence in the sound that seemed to follow me from corner to corner. I crouched by a trunk in the far corner, holding the flashlight tight. The air grew colder, denser, like I had walked into a pocket of winter that didn't belong. Then I heard it, my own name, just barely distinguishable, curling around the wooden beams above me. I froze. My heart hammered so loud it felt like the whole house could hear it. I stayed there only a few more minutes, but every second felt stretched thin, like time itself was straining. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it, that my mind had simply grown accustomed to the attic's loneliness. But the more I denied it, the more insistent the whispers became. When I finally descended the ladder, my legs shaking and my breath coming fast, the echo of those words followed me down the stairs and through the empty rooms. Even after the attic door clicked shut behind me, I could hear them in my mind, low and persistent, as if embedded into the very air around me. Over the next weeks, I avoided the attic entirely, yet the sound followed me in unexpected ways. A floorboard creaked in the kitchen, and I half expected the whisper to rise above it. Shadows in the corner of my vision seemed to twitch unnaturally, responding to me when I wasn't looking directly. My grandparents joked that old houses have their quirks, but I stopped laughing. I noticed the air would turn inexplicably cold in certain rooms at certain times, a pressure that was nearly tangible, pressing against my chest in the quiet moments before sleep. I had started to dread the evenings, the approach of darkness, and the thought of footsteps above me, though I knew the attic ladder hadn't been used. One night, I woke to a whisper right at my ear, urgent and unmistakable. I bolted upright, heart hammering, and the room was empty, but the cold lingered, like a presence had just been pressed against my skin. I got out of bed and checked the house, moving carefully, floorboards creaking under my weight. Everything was exactly as it should be, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed from somewhere high above, just beyond the reach of the light and warmth of the rooms I occupied. I eventually left my grandparents' house for college, telling myself I was leaving behind childish fears. Yet the memory of that attic, The whispers, the cold presence, and the twitching shadows clung to me, persistent and insistent, growing louder in my dreams and quieter moments alike. I returned years later. The house nearly the same, though dustier, with my grandparents gone. I couldn't resist a glance at the attic ladder, worn and creaking in the dim light of late afternoon. I almost didn't climb it, but the impulse was irresistible. I held the flashlight just as I had all those nights ago. The air was thick and cold as I ascended, pressing against me, carrying the faint murmur I had not heard for years. The whisper was almost friendly, teasing, yet beneath it lay the same dread, the same awareness of something just beyond the beam of light. I could feel it moving, circling, never fully revealed, never fully understood. Even now I sometimes hear it in the quiet hours. A soft scratch against an old wall, a low murmur carried on a cold draft. I know it isn't real, or at least I try to convince myself. But there's a weight to it, an insistence, and I can feel it in my chest, rising and falling like the attic itself is breathing. And I know that the attic never really left me. It is a shadow stitched into memory, a quiet, persistent presence that waits for the dark, and for me to remember it again. The whispers beneath the rafters are patient. They know I am listening, even when I try not to, and they will wait as long as they need to. It is in that waiting that the fear grows. Slow and inevitable, the kind of dread that does not scream but seeps into your bones. I sometimes wonder if the attic was ever really empty, or if it was waiting for me all along, hidden in plain sight, whispering secrets I cannot understand, pressing close to remind me that some things are meant to remain unseen, or at least only half glimpsed in the periphery of memory. The sound, the presence, the twitching shadows, they do not demand attention, but they insist upon it, patiently, silently, in that way that only the old forests and older houses seem to know. I have lived far from that ridge now, but sometimes in the middle of the night, I hear the faintest scratch, and I know without seeing that it is waiting for me again. I first noticed it one quiet evening, long after the sun had dipped behind the ridge and the forest around my grandparents' house had gone completely dark. The house always felt different at night, old and groaning, like it was alive in some subtle, slow way. But that night, there was something sharper, more deliberate. It started with a creak, low and deliberate, echoing up from the wooden attic stairs. At first I told myself it was the wind rattling the shutters, or the house settling as it had for decades. But the rhythm didn't match anything natural. There was a pause, a long stretch of silence, and then the creak again. One step, pause, another step. Deliberate, purposeful. It felt like someone pacing just out of sight, waiting. My heart thumped in my chest, but I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Just the imagination of a teenager alone in an old house. The sounds continued nightly. At first I ignored them, telling myself it was harmless, that the house was simply old. But slowly I began noticing small changes in my surroundings. Books that had been stacked one way were slightly askew. Chairs nudged just enough to catch my eye. Objects I could swear I hadn't touched were now shifted, just enough to make me doubt myself. I brought it up to my grandmother once cautiously, and she smiled, shaking her head. "Old houses breathe, child," she said, her voice gentle. "They settle, they move. Don't pay 'em no mind." But it wasn't the air that was moving, I realized, and it wasn't the house that watched. I felt eyes, patient, waiting, watching me. A presence just beyond my reach, perched somewhere above, silent until it wanted to be heard. It grew worse over the following weeks. The steps would start later and later into the night, often when I was lying awake in bed, the shadows of the hallway stretching long and thin from the dim moonlight filtering through the windows. Each creak felt like it knew where I was, where I might be looking, deliberately avoiding my gaze. I became careful, hyper-aware. I stopped leaving doors open, and I moved quietly when I needed a glass of water at night, hoping not to provoke whatever was up there. Still the creaks came, deliberate and patient, always above me, sometimes slow, sometimes quick, always too purposeful to be the house settling. Finally, I could take it no longer. My curiosity and fear intertwined until I felt trapped, needing to know what waited above me, even as my stomach churned at the thought. That night, I gripped the edges of the attic ladder, my knuckles white, and began the slow climb. Every rung groaned beneath my weight, each one echoing like a gunshot in the stillness of the house. The air felt heavier as I neared the top, thick with dust and something else I couldn't name. I paused, listening. Silence. Then a soft shift, almost imperceptible, like the ladder had moved just slightly under some unseen weight. I froze. My heart hammered so loudly I was certain it would give away my presence. When I finally peered into the attic, flashlight trembling in my hands, it was empty, or at least it seemed so. Moonlight pooled across boxes, trunks, and old furniture draped in yellowed sheets. Everything appeared undisturbed, and yet the ladder just behind me was slightly tilted as if someone, or something, had been using it while I wasn't looking. The beam of my flashlight caught on a corner, and I swear I saw a shadow shift out of the corner of my eye, just beyond reach. I turned quickly, and it was gone. My breath came fast and shallow. I felt exposed, a small thing alone in a vast silent space. The attic didn't feel like an attic anymore. It felt alive, watching, calculating, patient in a way that made my chest ache with fear. I climbed down faster than I had climbed up, fumbling with the bottom rung, heart racing so hard I thought I might pass out. Once on the ground, I bolted from the attic, the sound of my own footsteps deafening in the silence of the house. Yet, even after closing the ladder and the door, I felt it. That same patient gaze, the memory of deliberate steps just above, and the certainty that I had been watched, that the empty space had not been empty at all. I could hear faint echoes in my mind, small creaks that weren't really there, shadows flicking at the edge of my vision. I told myself it was my imagination, but a part of me knew better. The house was not merely settling. In the following days, I tried to ignore it, pretending nothing had happened. I stayed downstairs more, sleeping with my door closed, avoiding the creak of the attic stairs whenever I could. But the memory lingered, persistent and insistent. Each night I would hear small noises from above. Not full footsteps, but soft, deliberate shifts that made me tense up, listening. I would catch glimpses of shadows where they shouldn't be, the corner of a sheet moving as though a hand had brushed against it. I began leaving the house's interior doors open, keeping my room illuminated at all times, trying to reassure myself that I was safe on the ground floor. Weeks later, my grandmother passed away and the house felt emptier than ever. I returned one afternoon to pack up some belongings. The attic ladder loomed as it always had, and I could feel the weight of it, heavy and inviting. I debated whether to climb again, whether I could face what might be there, but something compelled me upward. I gripped the rungs, feeling their familiar groan under my hands. The attic greeted me with the same oppressive air, the dust motes catching in the pale light from the single window. I swept my flashlight over the corners, over the old furniture, the trunks, the boxes. Nothing moved. Nothing. And yet, I could feel it, waiting, patient, just beyond the beam of light. The ladder, slightly askew as before, suggested that it had not gone unused. Something had been up here, hiding, pacing, waiting for me to notice. Even now, years later, I can remember the way that air felt, thick and cold and pressing, how every shadow seemed to twitch in anticipation. I left that house behind, moving far away, but sometimes I hear a creak in my current home, a soft step that matches no one's presence. And for a heartbeat, I am back there, at the foot of the attic ladder, feeling the weight of unseen eyes, knowing that something patient and deliberate waits above, unseen, but very much there. The memory clings, stubborn, insistent, and I sometimes wonder if that house was ever empty at all, or if it was simply waiting for someone like me to notice, to feel the deliberate creaks and the quiet dread that comes with being watched and knowing it. There are nights I dream of climbing the ladder again, of stepping into the attic and feeling the air thicken, the shadows twitching as they always did. I never see anything, yet I feel the presence, patient and calm, watching, waiting. The house, the attic, the ladder. They all feel alive in those dreams, and I wake with my chest tight, the memory of creaks echoing in my ears. Even in waking hours, that quiet dread persists, subtle and unrelenting, a reminder that some parts of old houses, like old forests, hold more than memory or dust. They hold awareness, and sometimes if you listen closely, you can hear it moving, deliberate and patient, right above you. I hated going up to the attic, hated it with a weight I couldn't fully explain. From the moment I first climbed the narrow stairs, the air felt different. heavy and still, like the rest of the house belonged to the living, and the attic belonged to something else entirely. The space was cramped, low-ceilinged, and always smelled faintly of mildew, of old wood that had soaked in decades of dust and damp. But it wasn't the smell or the tightness that unsettled me most. No, what terrified me, the thing that rooted me to the foot of those stairs more than anything, was the shadows. They moved in ways that defied the angles of the light. They were never fully formed, never solid, and yet, somehow, they responded. I first noticed it while doing homework at the kitchen table. I left the hall light on and glanced toward the attic entrance. At the very edges of the beam, the shadows seemed to twitch, to stretch and twist just slightly before recoiling into the corners. At first, I told myself it was my imagination. Old houses played tricks on your eyes, I thought. But then I caught them again, and again, moving when I wasn't looking directly. Sometimes they seemed to mimic me, jerking when I moved, freezing when I turned away, only to shift again when I let my gaze wander. I felt watched, every muscle in my body taut, and no matter how many times I forced myself to look, there was nothing. Nothing except the feeling of eyes, patient and calculating, perched just beyond reach. One evening, foolishness got the better of me. I spoke out loud, half in jest, as if to challenge whatever might be up there. "You like to dance, huh?" The words barely left my mouth before I felt the air thicken. The shadows moved instantly, slow and deliberate, curling across the rafters in ways that were just slightly unnatural, just slightly impossible. I froze in place, heart hammering in my chest. The hair on my arms rose. It wasn't playful. It was a reply. Not with words, but with motion, deliberate and intimate, as though they were responding to me personally. I had never felt anything like it. My grandmother would have told me it was nonsense, that old houses had odd lighting and strange corners, that the mind made monsters out of dust. I wanted to believe that, but deep down I knew I wasn't imagining it. After that, I began to dread every step into the hallway at night. Even leaving the lights on didn't help. The air around the attic felt heavier, almost viscous, carrying with it the pressure of something observing, waiting. I would catch glimpses of movement at the periphery of my vision, long, thin streaks across beams, the hint of a form that dissolved whenever I tried to focus. The attic door itself seemed to breathe, opening and closing ever so slightly with no breeze, creaking under a weight that shouldn't have been there. I began avoiding the space entirely, staying downstairs where the light was constant, where the shadows couldn't reach me as easily. Weeks passed and the dread only grew. Shadows were everywhere, lingering just beyond the reach of sight, waiting until I wasn't looking. I noticed subtle changes. Objects that had been left in one place shifted slightly, small signs of disturbance I could never fully explain. The air felt charged, thick with the kind of quiet that presses against your ears and chest at the same time. On some nights I could hear faint creaks from the attic floorboards above, the sound slow and deliberate, as though someone were pacing just out of view. My grandmother still laughed it off when I mentioned it, saying the house was old, the timbers settling, the attic always being strange. I wanted to believe her, wanted to think that all of this was simply the natural quirks of a house left to time and weather. But no explanation fit perfectly. The shadows seemed to have an intelligence, patience, something I couldn't name. One night the fear became too much, and yet so did the curiosity. I forced myself up the narrow stairs, gripping the handrail so tightly my knuckles ached. The attic greeted me with the same oppressive air I remembered, the smell of mildew and dust, the low ceiling brushing my head, the quiet so thick it pressed against my eardrums. I clicked on a small flashlight, letting the narrow beam cut a swath through the darkness. The shadows twitched immediately, like living things, curling and stretching away from the light, but never disappearing entirely. I tried to focus, moving the flashlight slowly from corner to corner. Every time I thought I saw a form, it vanished. Every time I stopped to listen, I felt the presence of something just beyond my vision, patient, observing. Aware of every motion I made, I explored the attic cautiously, stepping over trunks and discarded furniture, heart hammering with every creak of the floorboards. The shadows reacted to me, subtle but undeniable. They seemed to stretch when I approached, recede when I looked away, always moving in the periphery, always teasing, always deliberate. I could feel my own panic rising, sharp and insistent, like a living thing pressing against my chest. I wanted to run, to leap down the stairs and never look back, but a part of me, terrified and morbidly fascinated, kept me there, compelled to see what they would do next. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes. The attic remained empty, save for the dust and old furniture, and yet the shadows moved with an unnerving rhythm. They were like echoes of something alive, imitating me, studying me, aware that I was aware. I whispered to them softly, almost in apology. "I don't mean to bother you." The movement slowed, curling in response, deliberate and almost mournful, as if they understood me, and yet held a boundary I could never cross. The weight of their gaze pressed against me, not physically, but with an undeniable insistence that left me hollow in the chest. When I finally descended, my legs trembling, the hall lights spilling warm yellow across the floorboards, I felt the shadows linger in my mind. Even with the attic door closed, I could sense them, patient and knowing, just beyond reach. I tried to shake it off, focusing on everyday life, chores, the mundane rhythm of my days, but the memory persisted. In quiet moments, I would catch a twitch in the corner of my eye, a shadow that seemed too deliberate, too aware to be normal. Even in rooms far removed from the attic, I felt their presence, lingering in the air, heavy and patient. Years later, I returned to the house after my grandparents passed. The attic ladder was the same, the ceiling low, the smell of mildew lingering like a memory pressed into the walls. I almost didn't climb it, but I had to know if it had always been empty, or if it had truly watched me all those years ago. The attic air pressed down on me immediately, familiar and suffocating, carrying that same sense of patient observation. Shadows shifted in the corners, just out of the light, slow and deliberate. I felt a shiver run down my spine, a mixture of fear and recognition. Nothing fully revealed itself, yet I felt certain I was not alone. Something had waited, and perhaps was still waiting, just beyond the beam of my flashlight, patient, deliberate, and persistent. Even now, far from that house, I sometimes see them in the corners of my vision. Shadows that move when I look away, stretch when I approach, recede when I focus. I tell myself it's my mind, old fear embedding itself into memory, but I can feel it, the same presence I felt in the attic, the quiet patience, the deliberate observation. I remember the oppressive air, the curling, teasing shadows, the sensation of something watching from just out of reach, and I know that wherever I am, there's a part of that attic that never left me, a lingering dread that persists quietly, insistent and patient, like the shadows themselves. I first noticed the trunk on a gray, rainy afternoon, when the attic seemed more oppressive than usual. I had gone up to fetch some old photo albums, expecting the usual clutter, dusty boxes, yellowed newspapers, trunks I had seen my entire life, but tucked in a far corner, half hidden behind a stack of faded quilts, was one I had never seen before. Its wood was dark, scratched and worn, etched with strange symbols that had faded with age but still hinted at something deliberate, something older than the house itself. I knelt beside it, running my fingers along the carvings. There was a weight to it, not heavy in pounds, but in presence, as though it exhaled silently, aware of me. I lifted the lid slowly, expecting to see the usual. Old clothing, holiday ornaments, relics of forgotten lives. Instead, I found nothing, at least nothing visible. The interior was empty, lined with cracked velvet that had long since lost its color, and yet the air inside felt thicker than the attic around it. A cold pressure pressed against my chest, subtle at first, then insistent, like a hand pushing against my sternum, urging me to notice the space beyond the physical. I blinked and shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. Old houses carried strange drafts, I told myself. Shadows moved oddly in the corners, and dust settled in uneven patterns. Nothing more. But it wasn't nothing. Each time I returned to the attic, drawn back by a mixture of curiosity and unease, I felt that same pressure, heavier than air, colder than any draft. Sometimes when I lifted the lid, there was a faint sound. Soft, subtle thumps from within, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. I held my breath, straining to hear more, to understand. but the sound never developed beyond that quiet, pulsing rhythm. It was as if the trunk itself was alive in some unknowable way, breathing in the stillness of the attic. I began avoiding the trunk altogether. I would sweep past it without looking, leaving it tucked in its corner, hoping that ignoring it would make it less present. But the feeling persisted. On quiet afternoons, the attic seemed heavier, oppressive, the air thick and difficult to breathe. I could almost sense the trunk watching, waiting for me to lift its lid again. Shadows stretched and twitched in the corners, even when I left the attic door open. The house had always been alive with creaks and sighs, but now the noises felt deliberate, as though responding to the presence of the trunk and my awareness of it. One evening, emboldened by foolish bravery, I returned with a flashlight and sat before it. The beam cut through the dust motes, illuminating the worn carvings, the scratches in the wood, the subtle imperfections that had accumulated over decades. I lifted the lid, my hands trembling, and stared into the empty interior. The cold pressed against me immediately, sharper than I remembered, as if the trunk had been waiting, anticipating my return. I could feel the rhythm of something beneath me, subtle thumps that beat like a heartbeat, irregular yet insistent, filling the silence of the attic with a presence that refused to be ignored. I leaned closer, trying to convince myself it was just an echo, some trick of the floorboards or the old timbers. But the thumps responded, pulsing in time with my own heartbeat, quickening when I hesitated, slowing when I paused. My mind raced, imagining all manner of explanations, but none seemed adequate. The house had no animals above this level, and the wind could not produce a rhythm so precise. I felt a deep dread settle into my bones, the kind that gnaws quietly at your chest and makes each breath a labor. The next days, I found myself dreading the attic. Even in daylight, with sunlight streaming through grimy windows, the corner where the trunk sat seemed darker, colder, somehow separate from the rest of the space. I began noticing subtle changes around it. The lid ever so slightly askew, dust disturbed in patterns I could not explain, the faint thumping sometimes audible even from the bottom of the ladder. I would freeze at the sound, my imagination racing, imagining that something waited just beneath the surface, something patient and aware. I tried to tell myself I was being silly, that the house had simply shifted, that the trunk was merely old wood settling. But the feeling refused to be explained away. I stopped going up there for weeks. I would glance at the attic door from the living room and feel a shiver run down my spine, the same cold pressing against my chest, the same subtle insistence that whatever was inside the trunk had noticed my absence and was waiting for me to return. I tried to keep busy, to convince myself the trunk and its strange carvings were meaningless, but each time I closed my eyes at night, I could see the lines etched into the wood, and in the silence I could hear the faint pulsing rhythm that had no origin I could identify. Eventually, I forced myself to go back. My curiosity had grown too strong to ignore, despite the fear that churned in my stomach. The attic greeted me with the familiar mildew scent, thick and suffocating. Dust motes floated lazily in the flashlight's beam, catching on the carved edges of the trunk which sat silently in its corner. I approached slowly, every footstep deliberate, listening to the floorboards creak under my weight. When I lifted the lid, the cold pressed against me immediately, sharper, heavier, and the faint thump began again, as if the trunk recognized me. I froze, unable to pull my hands away, unable to look elsewhere. The rhythm pulsed through the air, through my chest, synchronized with my own heart in a way that felt deliberate, knowing. I could not see anything, and yet I felt the presence of something there. It was patient, indifferent to my terror, aware of me in a way that made my skin crawl. I tried speaking, barely a whisper, telling it I meant no harm, trying to calm myself. But the thumps continued, insistent and irregular, like a heartbeat that had its own agenda. I leaned closer, gripping the edges of the trunk, and I swore I felt something inside shift beneath my fingers, subtle and heavy, as if acknowledging my touch without breaking the rules of some unspoken boundary. I retreated eventually, my legs shaking, the trunk's cold pressing against me even as I descended the ladder. I left it there, cornered and silent, but the memory lingered. The rhythm haunted my dreams, echoing through my mind at odd hours. I could not shake the sensation that it waited, patient in its corner, untouched yet alive, observing when I was absent. The air in my room sometimes carried the same weight, the same cold pressing against my chest, subtle but undeniable. Even years later, I cannot forget it. I return in my mind to that attic, to the corner with the trunk, to the faint pulse of the thumping inside, waiting, silent yet insistent. I imagine opening the lid again, feeling the cold press, hearing the heartbeat echo through the air, and knowing somehow that it is not entirely empty, that the trunk waits for me and perhaps for others, holding its secret in a way that cannot be explained or dismissed. The memory lingers, persistent and patient, like the trunk itself, reminding me that some things, once noticed, refuse to be unseen, and that the quiet corners of old houses can hold awareness, waiting in silence for the next curious soul to return. I remember that Saturday as if it had stretched into weeks. The attic was crowded with boxes stacked haphazardly, every corner brimming with decades of forgotten junk. Old photo albums, brittle papers, blankets that had yellowed with age, trunks stuffed with clothes I would never wear. I had decided that morning to finally organize it all. Sunlight poured weakly through the grimy window, illuminating the dust that floated in lazy motes like slow-falling snow. The air was thick and dry, carrying the faint, musty scent of old wood and mothballs. I was moving boxes carefully, stacking them in neat rows when I first heard it, a rustle. At first I froze, thinking it must be the wind, though the windows were closed tight. The sound came from the far side of the attic, soft, like paper shifting against cardboard. I held my breath, straining to listen. Nothing. The rustle had stopped, as if it had been a whisper, a tease, something testing the boundaries of the silence. I called out softly, half laughing at myself. "Hello?" The words felt absurd in the quiet space. There was no answer, only the echo of my own voice bouncing off the low rafters. I told myself it was probably nothing. Boxes settling under their own weight, old packing papers shifting. But the unease didn't leave. As I bent down to adjust a stack, I heard it again, a faint scratching, soft and irregular, moving across the tops of boxes. I froze, breath caught in my throat. The sound stopped whenever I approached, always just out of reach. My chest tightened, a dull ache that I ignored at first, chalking it up to tension. But the scratching persisted, subtle, deliberate, like someone, or something, was moving among the boxes when I wasn't looking. I began to feel the attic watching me, the air heavier, the silence thicker, as if it had been waiting for me to notice. I left for a few hours, telling myself I'd return later, hoping the rustling was a figment of my imagination. When I came back, the sunlight had shifted, casting long shadows across the dusty floor. I froze before I even touched the ladder. The boxes were slightly rearranged. Not drastically, but just enough to make me pause, to make me question everything I had left in order. It was subtle. A stack that had leaned against the wall now faced the opposite direction. A pile that had been neat, now slightly crooked. My heart raced. I tried to tell myself it was possible I had done it and forgotten, though I knew that wasn't true. The rustling returned that evening, after the house had settled into its usual quiet. I crept up the stairs slowly, trying to make as little sound as possible. The attic was darker now, shadows clinging to every corner. I moved toward the boxes cautiously, flashlight in hand. The sound came again, subtle, soft, almost polite in its timing, moving from box to box. I stopped, holding the beam steady, trying to catch whatever it was. Nothing. Not a movement. Not a shape. Just the boxes, still as death. And the faint scratching that seemed to follow me wherever I went. I sat on the floor, trying to calm my racing heart. The noise seemed to have a rhythm, soft and irregular, almost musical in its own way. It would pause when I turned toward it, resume when I looked away. I began to feel dizzy, as if the attic itself was breathing, watching me with patience and quiet intelligence. My imagination raced, conjuring possibilities. Mice? A raccoon? No, the rhythm was too precise, too deliberate. And no animal could have shifted the boxes while I had been gone, arranging them subtly, almost teasingly, as though aware of my absence. Days passed, and the attic became unbearable. I dreaded the rustling, the subtle shifting of shadows, the faint scratches that never seemed to stop. I tried to leave boxes stacked in a particular order, hoping that would prevent it, but it was no use. The boxes rearranged themselves subtly, and the scratching continued, always just out of reach. The house felt alive in a new way. The air itself seemed to carry intent, pressing down on me when I moved through the attic, curling around the stacks of forgotten things. I became cautious, moving slowly, checking corners, never turning my back, listening for the faintest sound that might betray a presence. One evening, as the sun sank behind the ridgeline, I heard it again, a rustle, soft and deliberate, accompanied by a faint thump, almost like the floorboards themselves were sighing. I froze, flashlight trembling in my hand. I spoke softly, almost pleading, "Who's there?" The sound stopped. Silence. My heart pounded. I stepped closer, moving slowly between the boxes, shining the beam carefully. I felt the shadows twitch at the edge of my vision, subtle but undeniable. My chest tightened, the air itself seeming to resist me. The boxes were still, yet I could feel the rhythm beneath the wood, a pulse that wasn't mine. I backed away slowly, feeling a deep dread settle into my bones. Something was in the attic, something patient, deliberate, observing me, aware of my presence, yet hidden from sight. I tried to convince myself it was the house, that the shadows and noises were natural. But the subtle rearrangements, the rhythmic scratching, the shifting air, it all defied explanation. I left the attic door closed, locked it as best I could, yet the sense of being watched lingered, pressing down on me even in the hall below. Weeks later, I returned to gather some old belongings for storage. The attic greeted me as always, thick, dusty, the faint smell of mildew pressing against my nostrils. I approached the corner where the boxes were stacked, my hands tight around the flashlight. The rustle returned almost immediately, soft and teasing, moving from one corner to the next. I froze in place, the beam of the light trembling. The boxes were subtly rearranged again, as if aware of my approach, aware that I had returned. The air felt alive, thick with quiet intent, pressing against my chest, filling my lungs with something I could not name. I tried speaking again, my voice low and hesitant. "I don't mean any harm." The scratching paused, as if listening. The rustling returned, faint, subtle, deliberate. I could feel it circling me, moving through the stacks, and the shadows seemed to curl closer, bending just slightly under the weight of some unseen presence. I shivered, the hair on my arms rising. My breath came fast. I wanted to run, to escape the oppressive attic, but my feet were frozen, glued to the floor by some unseen insistence. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, I cannot say. I do not remember moving. I remember only the sound of shifting boxes, the rustle that came when I looked away, the subtle thumps that felt like a heartbeat, slow and irregular, but deliberate. I eventually climbed down, hands shaking, the attic door clicking softly behind me. But even after leaving, the sense of being watched lingered. The boxes remained in their subtle disarray, the air thick and heavy, and the faint scratching continued in my mind long after I had descended. Years later, the memory has never left me. I think of the attic often, of the rustling behind the boxes, of the subtle rearrangements, and the persistent thumps that seemed almost alive. I cannot explain it. There was nothing visible, nothing tangible, and yet I know the attic was never empty. Something was there, patient, deliberate, aware of me in ways I could not fully comprehend. The house, the boxes, the shadows, they all hold a memory, a presence, waiting in silence for the next curious soul to return and notice the subtle dance of what cannot be named. I first noticed the chill on a quiet night, the kind when the wind barely moved outside, and the house seemed to hold its breath. I'd been lying awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, when a sudden cold draft brushed the back of my neck. It wasn't like the wind from the windows or the gaps under the doors. The air felt heavier, almost deliberate, carrying a weight that pressed against my skin and made my hair stand on end. I told myself it was just the house cooling, that old timber contracting in the night. But there was a sharpness to it, a subtle edge that made my chest tighten. Something in the attic seemed alive. I had checked the hatch countless times. It was always closed, always locked. Yet the cold came from above, brushing down as if someone, or something, was leaning over me, just out of sight. That night, I sat up slowly, heart hammering. The draft returned, brushing my shoulders, moving with an almost tangible rhythm, curling like a living thing around the top of my spine. I could feel it, not in the air alone, but in the pressure against my skin, the way the hair on my arms and neck rose involuntarily. I shivered, gripping the blankets, trying to convince myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks in the stillness of an empty room. But it wasn't imagination. Something watched from above, patient and deliberate, unseen yet unmistakably present. I traced it with my eyes, following the line from the bed to the ceiling, imagining shadows curling and moving along the beams, twisting as if alive, just beyond the reach of light. Nights like that continued, subtle at first, then insistent. The cold would return in moments when I least expected it, when I was reading, when I was trying to sleep, when the house seemed utterly silent. It never came with a draft from an open window or vent. It always came from above. I began noticing small things, subtle signs that disturbed me more than the chill itself. Shadows in the corners of the room seemed to twitch just beyond my line of sight, flickering as if aware that I was looking. Objects on my bedside table shifted imperceptibly, never far, never dramatically, but enough to make me question my own memory. One night, the sensation was stronger than ever. I felt it brush against my neck, colder this time, almost wet, and my breath caught in my chest. I sat up, shivering, flashlight in hand, tracing the beam to the ceiling. The attic hatch loomed silently, closed as always, the hinges stiff and old. I leaned closer, straining my ears, but the house offered only silence in reply. My pulse thumped in my ears, a reminder of how alone I was. I imagined the shadows moving above me, bending over the edges of the beams, stretching and curling in ways that weren't quite natural, yet never fully revealed. I could sense the presence, patient and watchful, waiting for me to notice, to react, to acknowledge it. I began avoiding sleeping alone, leaving a light on in the hallway to keep the shadows at bay. But even then, the feeling persisted. I could feel it, high above, waiting in silence, pressing subtly into the room. Some nights I would wake to a sudden cold on my shoulder, a brush of air that had no source I could find. I would sit up, scanning the ceiling, the edges of the walls, the old hatch, but always there was nothing. Yet the sense of being observed never left. My imagination told me it was the house, my own fear, exhaustion, or a trick of the mind. But a part of me knew better. It was deliberate, intelligent in its subtlety, patient and unmoving, yet entirely present. Weeks went by, and I became increasingly tense. I would check the attic hatch obsessively, tapping on it, pressing my ear against the wood. The old timber never moved, never groaned beyond its usual settling. Yet the cold returned night after night, brushing against my neck or shoulders as if someone, or something, was perched just above, watching me in silence. Sometimes I would dream of climbing the ladder, of stepping into the attic and finding nothing but shadows. Even in the dreams, I felt the weight of that presence, pressing against my chest, watching me carefully, deliberately. Eventually, I tried reasoning with it, speaking softly into the darkness of my bedroom. "I'm not bothering you," I whispered, voice shaking. The air shifted then, subtly, a small rush of cold that made me gasp. No sound accompanied it, no visible sign, only the feeling that it had acknowledged me. I shivered, the blankets bunching in my hands, and told myself I was imagining it, that I was losing control over fear. Yet in the quiet I could feel its patience, its deliberate attention, as if it had been waiting for me to recognize it all along. Even during the day, I began noticing small things. The attic hatch seemed to weigh heavier. The shadows along the beams lingered, curling subtly. The air in my room felt denser, as if something pressed against it from above, though I could see nothing. I could not explain it. No drafts, no animals, no mechanical cause. The sensation was personal, targeted, as though it followed me, aware of my habits, of my presence, of my fear. I became jumpy, hesitant to lie down alone, always glancing upward, always aware of that cold breath lingering in memory, pressing silently, patiently, just out of sight. Years later, I remember it clearly. The sensation never fully left, and I still wake sometimes in the middle of the night with a chill along my spine. I see the hatch above my bed in dreams, always shut, always still, yet heavy with the weight of something patient and deliberate. I hear nothing. Yet I feel a presence pressing, waiting, and I know, deep down, that some part of that house, some part of the attic, remains aware of me. It is not malevolent in the way one expects, but it is undeniably there, patient, observant, waiting quietly above my bed, brushing coldly along my skin, a reminder that the old house was never empty, and some presences are best left unprovoked. I've lived in that cabin my entire life, or at least since I was old enough to remember it well. It sat perched on a ridge above the old hollow, the kind of place where the road ended and only woods continued for miles, broken only by the occasional creek or abandoned coal shack. My grandparents built it decades ago, rough-hewn timber and tin roofing, the kind of place where every board creaks and every wind gust makes the whole structure groan. I always thought the attic floorboards were just old and thin, prone to settling and echoing under the weight of the house. But I learned one thing the hard way. Some sounds aren't caused by the house at all, and started in the late fall when the nights grew long, and the hollow outside was quiet except for the occasional caw of a crow or the whistle of the wind through the holler. I was lying in bed staring at the ceiling when I first heard it, a faint, irregular thump above me. At first I assumed raccoons or squirrels on the tin roof, small animals moving across the boards. But the pattern didn't fit anything I knew. It was deliberate, measured, each step distinct, sometimes quick, sometimes slow, as though pacing. The sound didn't move randomly across the roof. It circled, tracing lines over the ridge above and always in a rhythm that seemed patient and intentional. I tried to convince myself it was the house settling. The roof boards were old, warped in places, and the attic joists had a way of amplifying even the smallest noises. But there was something in the cadence, a precision that didn't match creaking wood or the scurrying of wildlife. It followed me, subtly, across the house. When I walked from the bedroom to the kitchen, the thump seemed to pause, then continue once I was still. When I returned to the bedroom, the sequence resumed, never quite matching the first pattern, but always present, always above me. The nights I slept with the windows open, thinking maybe the wind carried the sound strangely. The footsteps remained. I began timing them, listening with my heart hammering. Sometimes the pacing quickened, almost impatient, then slowed, deliberate again. There was a logic to it, a repetition that suggested awareness. I remember lying there in the dark, gripping the quilt, wishing it would stop, yet feeling a morbid curiosity. Something in me needed to understand what was making those steps, moving in rhythm above my head. I mentioned it once to my grandfather. He chuckled, shaking his head, saying old cabins make noises you'll never figure out. "Timber moves, boy," he said. "Tin roofs groan. Ain't nothing alive up there." But I knew better. He wasn't wrong about the creaks of timber, but he didn't hear the pattern, the measured pacing, the subtle weight behind each step. It was patient, watching. I didn't tell him about the nights I could swear it followed me down the hall, echoing through the joists, pausing when I stopped, resuming when I thought I'd left it behind. One night, curiosity overcame fear. I decided to climb the attic ladder, the one that hinged down from the ceiling in the hallway, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever it was. The ladder groaned under my weight, each step echoing into the empty space above. The attic itself was sparse, low-ceilinged, lined with old insulation and dusty boxes, nothing that should have made the sound I had been hearing. Yet the thumps didn't stop. They shifted slightly, softer now, almost like a whisper of movement across the boards, but still distinct, still deliberate. I froze, listening, heart racing. The steps seemed aware of my presence, halting in moments that made my chest tighten with dread. I traced the floorboards with my flashlight, the beam revealing warped planks and old nail heads glinting in the dim light. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound besides my own breathing and the occasional whistle of wind through the eaves. But I could feel it, something unseen, deliberate, pacing just out of reach. I stayed in the attic for as long as I could bear it, my hands clutching the edges of a box for balance, but eventually I had to retreat, descending the ladder with every nerve on edge. After that night, I slept with a flashlight by the bed. The footsteps continued, always above me, subtle, measured, almost patient. I began to notice other things, the way the floorboards sometimes shifted slightly, as if pressed by weight that wasn't mine. How the attic hatch sometimes rattled gently even when the wind was still, and the way the shadows moved along the rafters, curling and uncurling in patterns I couldn't explain, I tried ignoring it, pretending it was just the house settling, but the dread clung to me, sinking into my chest like a weight I could not lift. The presence became more noticeable during storms. When rain pounded the tin roof, the footsteps seemed to continue on top of the noise, steady, determined, following their own rhythm. Lightning flashed, illuminating the attic in stark white light through the small window near the ridge. I swore I saw a shadow pass, long and deliberate, crossing the boards in a way that had no logical origin. My hands shook as I tried to convince myself it was only my mind playing tricks in the darkness, but it wasn't imagination. The pattern persisted, familiar, patient, undeniably real. I began documenting it, writing down the times and durations, noting the pauses and accelerations. The rhythm followed me through the house, precise in a way that no raccoon or squirrel could achieve. I started noticing it during the day too, faintly, in the attic above me while I worked on chores or fixed furniture. It seemed to exist outside of time, not confined to night or day, only to the attention I paid. Sometimes it slowed to a near halt, and I could feel the attic pressing down, the air thick with unseen observation, almost expectant. One night, a week before the first frost, I heard a series of rapid steps, running across the roof in a way that sounded urgent, almost desperate. My heart thumped in my chest, but I didn't move. I listened, counting the beats, the pauses, the rush of boots on old boards. Then it stopped suddenly, leaving a heavy silence that pressed against my ears, a stillness more terrifying than the noise. I felt something above, patient but aware that I had noticed, waiting for me to react, to acknowledge it. I pulled the blankets over my head and stayed perfectly still until morning light crept through the window, though even then the memory of the rhythm lingered, echoing through the house. Years passed, and I moved through the cabin with caution. The footsteps never ceased. They became part of the house, part of the shadows that lingered in the corners of the ceiling and along the joists. I learned to live with it, though every so often, a sudden sequence of steps would make my blood run cold. A reminder that something watched, that the attic was not as empty as it appeared. I never saw anyone, never found proof of trespass or animal, and yet, the presence remained deliberate and patient, a quiet observer pacing its boards above me, even now. When I return to that cabin in the hollow, the footsteps greet me. I hear them above as I lie in bed, soft and measured, sometimes slow, sometimes quick, always deliberate. I know they are aware of me, following me in the attic, tracing the boards overhead. I will never be able to explain them, and I do not try. The rhythm is patient, indifferent to my fear, yet unignorable. A constant reminder that some things in these hills move with intent, silent but ever present, waiting just above, pacing their boards with quiet persistence. I had spent most of my life in that cabin, though not all of it consciously. My grandparents built it years ago, tucked on a ridge above a winding hollow in eastern Kentucky, and after they passed, it became mine by default. It was the kind of place where time moved slowly, where the hollow below swallowed sound, and the only noises were the wind through the pines, the creek burbling over rocks, and the occasional creak of the cabin itself. The house was built solidly, rough-hewn logs and old timber, but like all old cabins, it had its secrets. One of them I discovered only after years of living there. Was a small locked door I had never noticed before. It was tucked behind a stack of old furniture in the corner of the back hall, partially hidden by a tall wardrobe and a collection of dusty crates. At first glance, it looked mundane, almost forgettable. Plain wood, a simple iron handle, hinges that had darkened with age. I remember the first time I noticed it properly, dusting around the area on a hot summer afternoon, sunlight catching the edges of the door and casting a narrow, persistent shadow along the floorboards. I paused, my hand hovering over the handle, curious, but instinct told me to leave it be. There was something about the door that felt heavy, not in weight exactly, but in presence. That first night I heard it. A moan, soft and drawn out, a whisper of sound that seemed to come from the door itself. It wasn't a creak from the floorboards, not the groan of the roof settling. It was the hinges, straining as though someone or something were pressing against them from the other side. I froze in bed listening, the beam of my bedside lamp trembling across the walls. The moan repeated at irregular intervals, subtle, almost deliberate. I told myself it was the house. That old wood sometimes complains in ways you don't expect. But even then, my chest tightened, and I felt a lingering awareness, like the room itself was holding its breath. The nights that followed, the sound returned. Sometimes it was just a quiet sigh, a long exhale from the hinges. Other times it grew louder, a low, drawn-out groan that seemed to crawl along the timber and into my bones. I never attempted to open the door. I didn't need to. Its presence was enough. At times, when the house was still and the wind had died down, I could swear I heard muffled whispers behind it, indistinct voices, fragments of speech that weren't meant for me. I held my breath and listened, straining to catch words that would never come. And always, there was a pause afterward, a pregnant silence that seemed to stretch the night itself into something heavier, more tangible. Days passed, and I began noticing small things around the hallway. Dust on the floorboards would be slightly disturbed, tiny scuff marks near the base of the door. Furniture subtly shifted as though the space had been disturbed. I would check and recheck, certain it was my own carelessness. Yet deep down I knew it wasn't. The house had rhythms I understood, the groan of logs, the whistle of wind through cracks. But this was different. It was precise, deliberate, watching, patient. One evening, late in October, the wind drove through the hollow like it had a purpose, rattling the tin roof and tugging at the eaves. I had been sitting in the kitchen, cup of coffee in hand, when the door moaned again, louder this time, almost as if impatient. The sound crawled up the wall, echoing through the hall, and I could feel it in my chest, a vibration that resonated like a heartbeat I hadn't expected. I approached slowly, hand trembling as I brushed away a layer of dust from the handle. It remained cold beneath my fingertips, iron smooth and unyielding. I pressed my ear to it, and for a moment the world held still. There was nothing except the faintest shift, a sigh of movement that made my stomach knot. Sleep became impossible. Each night I would lie awake, listening for the door. Its groans would punctuate the stillness, at times rapid, almost urgent, then long and slow, deliberate. Shadows from the furniture stretched across the walls in ways I couldn't predict, and sometimes they seemed to pulse, bending toward the door and retreating as if aware of my gaze. I began leaving a small lamp in the hallway, hoping light alone would keep it quiet, but the moan never ceased. It simply adapted, softer in tone, patient, deliberate, like it had grown accustomed to my attention and was willing to wait indefinitely for me to make the next move. Eventually, curiosity overpowered fear. One cold, still night in December, I approached the door with a flashlight in one hand and a set of old keys in the other. I had never seen a lock like it before, small and simple, but I tried the keys one by one, though none fit. I pressed my ear against the wood again, and there it was, the groan, low and deliberate, a sound that seemed to echo inside the hollow of the door itself. I imagined the air on the other side moving, thick and heavy, filled with some presence I could not see. I wanted to open it, to see what was inside, but a shiver ran through me, and I realized I wasn't ready. Even after years in this house, there were things I was not meant to confront directly. I began keeping a notebook, documenting every moan, every shift in tone, every subtle whisper I thought I heard. I could hear it during the day sometimes, faint, almost teasing, a reminder that it existed regardless of my attention. Sometimes I would hear a phrase, broken and indistinct, like someone trying to communicate from behind a veil. The words made no sense, but the intention felt clear. It was aware. It was patient. And it was waiting. The seasons changed. Snow covering the ridge in white silence, leaves piling in the hollow below. Yet the door persisted. Its moans became part of the house, another rhythm alongside the wind through the pines and the creek's constant murmur. I learned to live with it, though every so often I would wake to a sharp, sudden creak, a sigh of hinges that made me hold my breath. My hands clenched on the quilt, imagining the space behind the door pressing forward, waiting for me to act. One morning as spring crept into the hollow, I noticed the dust on the floor in front of the door was disturbed again. Subtle smudges like footprints pressed into the old boards. I stared for a long time, heart hammering, unable to explain it. The house itself seemed to tighten around me, old logs and beams echoing the quiet insistence of the door. I never opened it, though I sometimes imagined what lay beyond. An empty space, a storage closet, or perhaps something far older, a memory embedded in the house, patient, deliberate, and waiting for me to notice. Years later, I can still hear it. The moan is quiet now, softened by time, but present nonetheless. I lie in bed and imagine it behind that small, locked door, breathing through the hinges, patient, deliberate, aware of me. The whispers return sometimes, fragments of speech too faint to understand, yet I feel them pressing against the walls of the hall, reaching for me, reminding me that the cabin is never truly empty. It waits, it watches, and it remembers. Even now, when I step into that hallway, I pause before passing the door. I can feel it in the air, heavy and silent, as if holding a secret too old, too patient for me to uncover. I will never open it. I have come to understand that some doors are meant to stay closed, some presences are meant to remain unseen, and some whispers are never meant to be understood. And yet, each night, when the house is quiet and the wind dies, I hear it again, moaning softly, deliberate and patient, a reminder that the cabin has its own memories, and some are older than anyone alive to witness them. I had always been wary of that attic. It was tucked at the far end of the cabin, a low-ceilinged space, cramped and dusty, smelling faintly of mildew and aged wood. The floorboards sagged in places, thin enough to let me hear every movement from below, yet solid enough to support my weight if I tread carefully. The window at the far end had always bothered me, though I couldn't say why. It was small, its glass cracked in one corner, dusty from years of neglect, and the frame was warped just enough to let the light of the moon stretch across the attic in odd, uneven shapes. For years I told myself it was nothing, just a window. But over time, I began seeing things, small movements that I couldn't explain, subtle signs that someone or something was watching. It started one autumn night, the wind rattling the tin roof above, the hollow below silent, except for the occasional whistle of a distant creak. I had climbed the attic ladder to fetch an old box of blankets, flashlight in hand, when I noticed it. A shadow, subtle and fleeting, crossing the cracked glass. I froze, heart thudding, convinced it was my imagination. The moonlight shifted, and the shadow disappeared, leaving only the dusty pane behind. I shook my head and laughed softly, telling myself I'd been staring at the corner of a box or the warped frame. But the feeling remained, a chill crawling along my spine, the sense of being observed, patient, and deliberate. Over the following weeks, the sightings became harder to ignore. I would glance up while organizing old furniture or sweeping the floorboards, and for a fleeting moment, a figure seemed to flicker behind the glass. It was never clear, just a shape, sometimes a face, pressed faintly against the window, blurred and distorted. The worst moments were when the moonlight fell just right, illuminating the cracks in the glass so that shadows stretched and warped in ways that felt almost deliberate. I began to feel a presence in the attic, waiting, watching, patient in a way that unsettled me more than any sudden noise ever could. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself the house, old and creaking, played tricks on the mind. Moonlight and dust, shadows from the rafters, perhaps the reflection of my own movements. These were the logical explanations I clung to. Yet my unease grew. I began noticing small things. Objects on the floor subtly shifted, footprints in the dust that weren't mine, the faint sensation of eyes tracking me even when I wasn't looking toward the window. I could feel the weight of attention, the slow, deliberate gaze of something unseen, pressing against me from the far end of the attic. One night, late in October, I climbed the ladder with a flashlight. Determined to confront the window, the beam illuminated the cracked glass, the warped frame, and the dust motes floating lazily in the air. The moment I focused on the window, I saw it again, a subtle movement behind the pane, like a figure stepping lightly across the boards outside, though I knew nothing could be there. My hands trembled as I held the flashlight, tracing the edges of the glass. For a moment, I thought I saw a face, pale and pressed faintly against the pane, eyes wide and blank. I blinked and it was gone. My pulse pounded in my ears and the air in the attic felt heavier, as though carrying the weight of a silent, deliberate presence. I stopped looking for a while, hoping that ignoring it would make the feeling go away, but the sense of being watched never left me. Sometimes, even when I was below in the living room, sweeping or tending to the fire, I would catch a glimpse of a shadow through the top of the ladder, the faintest hint of a shape behind the glass. It was always just beyond clarity, never fully revealed, yet undeniably there. I began leaving a small lamp near the base of the ladder, hoping to illuminate the window enough to dispel the shadows, but it didn't help. If anything, it seemed to accentuate the sense of presence, casting strange angles and highlighting shapes that shouldn't have existed. The phenomenon grew more disturbing over the months. The attic floorboards, already thin, seemed to vibrate subtly when I approached the window, though there was nothing on the boards themselves. I would feel the floor shift beneath my feet, as though accommodating some weight above, some presence pressing against the glass. The shadows moved in ways I could not predict, stretching when I wasn't looking, freezing when I tried to catch them directly. On more than one occasion, I thought I saw eyes, faintly glowing or reflecting the moonlight, staring at me with patient intensity before vanishing in a blink. One evening, I tried to speak to it, half in jest, half in desperation. "I'm not here to hurt you," I whispered, leaning toward the cracked glass. The attic was silent, save for the occasional creak of the boards and the faint whistle of wind through the eaves. I thought I heard a subtle shift behind the window, a soft movement like the brush of fabric or the scraping of something delicate. My heart sank. I realized that whatever, or whoever, was up there was aware, patient, observing, waiting for me to recognize its attention fully. The nights became harder to endure. I could hear it in my sleep, the attic seeming to carry a weight, a quiet presence pressing against the house itself. Dreams of faces pressed against the glass, distorted by dust and moonlight, haunted me. I would wake in the middle of the night, chest tight, imagining the window at the far end of the attic, the shape behind it, still watching, still patient. Even when I closed my eyes, I could feel its gaze, deliberate and unyielding, pressing against the edges of perception. Spring came, melting the snow and bringing warmth to the hollow, yet the presence remained. The window no longer seemed just a cracked pane of glass. It became a threshold, a portal through which I felt observed, judged, noted. I began noticing small signs, dust disturbed on the boards, faint impressions like hands pressed into the grime, shadows that lingered even when the sun streamed through the opening. I never touched the glass, never opened the window. It didn't need me to. Its awareness was patient, deliberate, eternal in a way I could not influence. Years passed. I moved through the cabin with care, avoiding prolonged glances at the attic, leaving small lamps in the hallway and the attic itself, trying to dispel the oppressive sense of observation. Yet the window's watchful eye remained, a quiet, deliberate presence that I could neither confront nor escape. I learned to accept it, to live with the feeling of being watched. Patient in its attention, as much a part of the cabin as the creaking roof, the thin floorboards, or the hollow below. Even now, when I step into the attic, flashlight trembling in hand, I pause at the far end, staring at the dusty, cracked window. Sometimes, just sometimes, I see a fleeting movement, a shadow, a faint face, the impression of eyes peering through the glass. I do not approach, do not speak, do not move closer. I have learned that some things are meant to remain distant, to be observed, but never understood. The presence is patient, deliberate, unyielding, and it will wait long after I am gone, pressed against the glass, watching, always watching, a silent guardian of the old attic and its secrets. I first noticed the whistling on a late spring night, long after the wind had died down and the hollow below the cabin was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl. It was faint at first, almost melodic, drifting down from the attic, and I told myself it was the wind catching the rafters in some strange harmony. I had lived in that family cabin in eastern Kentucky for as long as I could remember, inherited from my grandparents, and I knew every groan, creak, and whistle that old timber could produce. But this was different. It was deliberate in a way that no ordinary gust could replicate, and it carried a rhythm that seemed oddly familiar. At first I ignored it, thinking it a trick of my imagination. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, letting the sound drift around me, soothing in a strange way. But over the following nights, the whistling persisted, and then it changed. The tune became recognizable, though I couldn't place it at first. Eventually, memory clicked. It was a melody my grandfather used to whistle when he worked in the hollow. A simple song from decades past, one I hadn't heard in years. My chest tightened when I realized that the sound wasn't coming from below or beside me. It was coming from the attic itself. Something or someone was whistling that tune, and it was aware of me. I tried investigating, of course. I climbed the ladder slowly one night, flashlight in hand, heart hammering in my chest. The attic was low, cramped, and smelled faintly of mildew. Dust motes floated in the beam of light, catching the dim moonlight that filtered through the small window at the far end. The whistling stopped as soon as I set foot on the floorboards, deliberate in its timing, leaving a silence so heavy it pressed against my ears. I moved slowly, examining the rafters and boxes, the old furniture, the corners where shadows pooled. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. Yet the melody lingered in my mind, echoing long after the attic had gone quiet. The nights grew harder. I began hearing it even when I wasn't in the attic. The tune would drift down the hallway, soft at first, then louder as if following me. Sometimes it would start while I was making tea in the kitchen, pause while I froze, and then stop abruptly the moment I tried to locate the source. I began keeping notes, documenting the times, the duration, the nuances in the melody. It was as if the whistling was communicating, trying to tell me something, though I could never understand what. It was patient, deliberate, and entirely unyielding. I started noticing other signs. Small objects slightly shifted from where I had left them, dust disturbed in precise patterns across the attic floor, and the faint feeling of eyes watching me when I paused in the hallway. I would stare at the ceiling beams, imagining the weight of something just beyond my vision, aware of me, calculating, waiting. The attic was no longer just a space above the cabin. It had become alive in some quiet, deliberate way, a presence that communicated in the only manner it knew. That haunting, melodic whistle. One night I attempted to respond. I picked up a small harmonica I had found in a drawer, something my grandfather used to play. I played the same melody the attic whistled back at me, note for note, trembling with a mixture of fear and strange hope. For a moment, the attic was silent. Then the tune returned, softer this time, almost coaxing, lingering in the air like a deliberate reply. I froze, heart racing, and felt a pressure in the attic, as if the air itself carried a weight, a quiet acknowledgement. I didn't sleep that night, lying awake with the harmonica pressed to my chest, listening for the next phrase, the next note. Weeks turned into months. The whistling became a fixture, predictable yet unpredictable. Sometimes it mimicked my movements, echoing in patterns that felt intentional. Other times it would stop entirely, leaving only the creak of old timber and the sigh of wind through the eaves. I could never locate a source, nothing hidden in the rafters, no animals, no intruders. Just the attic, the melody, and the constant, patient awareness of something that existed beyond explanation. Occasionally, I would glimpse shadows moving in the corners of the attic, subtle, almost human in shape, but never close enough to recognize. The presence was deliberate in its distance, patient in its observation, communicating through melody rather than movement. It waited for me to notice, to acknowledge its existence, and I did, reluctantly, with a mixture of fear and fascination. One winter night, snow covering the ridge and hollow below, the whistling changed. It was slower, more deliberate, almost mournful. I lay in bed listening, feeling the pressure of attention in the room, and for the first time, I understood that it wasn't just whistling for the sake of sound. It was deliberate, patient, trying to convey something I could not grasp. I tried to match it with the harmonica again, but my fingers faltered, my breath shaking. The melody paused, then resumed, a gentle insistence, lingering in the rafters and embedding itself in my mind. Over the years, I learned to live with it, though the weight never left. I kept my lamps lit in the hallways, the attic ladder lowered but untouched, and I avoided long glances at the ceiling. Yet the whistling persisted, patient and deliberate, echoing the memory of my grandfather, embedding itself into the house, into the hollow, into me. It had become part of the cabin's rhythm, another presence alongside the creaking timber, the whistling wind and the hollow silence. Even now, when I return to the cabin after time away, the melody greets me. It drifts down from the attic, faint and melodic, deliberate in its timing, as if checking that I am still there, acknowledging my attention. I have never seen anyone, never found proof of anyone or anything in the attic. Yet the presence remains, patient, persistent, communicating in the only way it knows, through that haunting, familiar melody, a reminder that some presences endure, patient, deliberate, and entirely unknowable, watching through the rafters and whispering across the boards above.